Hi everyone, welcome to the Sports Psych Show. Today I'm joined by Nick Winkelman, who is Irish Rugby's Head of Athletic Performance and Science. Now, this man is a ball of energy and information, which is quite a great cocktail, I think. And whilst he isn't a sports psychologist, I know that he himself would say that he does psychology in his role every single day. So, without further ado, hi Nick, thanks for coming on the show.
Hey Dan, it's a pleasure to be on.
So, I've given people some idea of a little bit of what you do. You work with Irish Rugby, but I know you do a whole host of other stuff, and I really enjoyed a presentation you did in Ireland back in April. So why don't you fill in some gaps for us in terms of who you are, your CV, and also from that hello you did there, one thing to say is that you don't have much of an Irish accent, mate.
You got me there. You got me there. If you're going to get me on one thing, it's definitely I have not adopted the Irish accent yet. I'm working on it, but not quite there. You may have plenty of isms. It's definitely worked its way into my vocabulary. So maybe from a CV perspective, I'll work backwards for everybody. So as you said, I'm the head of athletic performance and science here for Irish Rugby. So I've been here now for just over 2.5 years. It's gone by incredibly quick. And the brief synopsis of my role is I have the luxury and the honor of working across both our national teams, so that's men's and women's 15s and 7s, as well as our 4 professional teams, so Leinster, Munster, Connacht, and Ulster. And specifically, I look at my role as supporting people, processes, planning with the player, if you would, right as the hub. And in doing so, working with all of our coaches to ensure that we have best practices in the way we approach and develop ourselves, looking at our processes or our systems, make sure everything that we do day in, day out is sustainable. It's on the bleeding edge of sports science and best practice to support our players. And then finally, we give ourselves the headspace to get in the crow's nest, to look straight ahead with the understanding that what got us here won't get us there. And the luxury is I can spend a bit more of my time up in that crow's nest while I know our coaches are day in, day out working on the ground, and then we can work together to make sure we have the best picture, again, to put our players in the best position to perform. So very much so, it's coach development. I still get out on the pitch, and I get to coach speed, which is phenomenal for me, get to run a lot of education and systems design. So it's a very diverse role. When people say, what do you do? I'm like, well, on what day, what month? Where do you want me to begin? Because it's an ever-evolving position. Prior to that, I was, again, strength conditioning coach for 10 years, working for a company called Exos, formerly known as Athletes Performance. And there I had 2 similar type of veins. Really, 3/4 of the year, I focused on coaching as a strength conditioning coach, working with elite military, NFL, really diversity of athletes, but primarily probably cut my teeth working with athletes preparing to go into the NFL Combine. And the rest of the year was spent running, again, our coach education at Exos, which inevitably turned out to be a pretty large arm of what we do when I was there. I think last time I checked, they were running courses in over 25 different countries. So that was very much so a great part of my upbringing. So in total, S&C coach about 16 years now with 2 very diverse lenses on what this field and what human development is all about.
So you're an S&C coach, you're an athletics trainer, but there's kind of a broad scope here. You've talked about supporting people and processes and systems, and I know that you travel the world and you talk a lot about the brain and the mind, and I know from speaking with you before, listening to you in Ireland, that your passion isn't just in the gym, it's not just out on the pitch talking and asking questions around athletic performance. You have a big interest and an enormous investment in people and subsequently the brain, the mind, the nervous system, how human beings function. Has that evolved over time? Have you learnt that that's a more pertinent part of your role over time? Or was that something that sort of naturally came to you straight away a decade ago?
Yeah, it's really, really interesting when you go back and interrogate, how an idea that you embrace today ever got in your head in the first place. And I think I have a kind of idea how I became interested in the brain and human behavior in general, and notably human learning is my main area of interest. And really for me, it started when I had my first job within really what was personal training at the time, trying to make a little bit of money on the side, supporting my young college career, so to speak. And one thing that I reflected on when I was just shadowing different personal trainers that had already gone through this course was how they communicated with people. And I found that while their programming was very similar, they did the same kind of exercises, the same kind of reps and sets. There wasn't a lot of difference there. What was different was the way they communicated. And I had one guy that I followed in particular. He primarily worked with bodybuilders, funny enough. And they almost called him the Q whisperer, because he could have somebody come in and just with language alone get them to focus differently. And then all of a sudden they would feel this nuanced muscle that they had been trying to feel for a long time. And now they could feel it, they could load it, they could develop it. And all of a sudden their bodybuilding career they thought would move on. But this guy really showed me something about just the power of language. And it was that early experience that kind of suggested to me that how we coach is probably as important as what we coach. And put differently, how we go about translating the ideas in our head into words so that they can then translate into thoughts in our athlete's head that make sense to them and help them learn skills better, faster, and more effectively. That just generally became an area that I interrogated, that I noticed throughout my career. But it really didn't mature until, I would say, probably 2007 to 2009, when I started to work within the NFL Combine Development Program at Exos. And it was kind of an interesting microcosm of human performance, because you'd have these really elite athletes coming from Division I programs who were already cited to be some of the best up-and-coming players in the NFL. So these people did not lack physical assets. In fact, they had them. They were plentiful. They probably could have loaned some of them out to others if they would like to and still have been just fine. So what was going on here was this. I had these guys for 8 weeks, which isn't a long time. And from a physical development perspective, these guys were sitting pretty close to their ceiling physically in strength, power, speed, agility, so on and so forth. However, these were football players. They weren't track athletes. So their ability to run a 40-yard dash, with complete efficiency to maximize their time was a massive opportunity for them. A lot of them looked like Bambi on ice, even though they could run blistering times. Mm-hmm. So my objective was to somehow get them to optimize these assets. And for listeners, one way to think about this is, if you've never driven a race car, imagine someone drops a race car in your driveway in the morning. Just because you have this immense possibility sitting in this driveway doesn't mean you have any clue how to maximize it. Right? And I definitely would be one of those individuals. So I saw my athletes very much through this lens. And inevitably what it got me to interrogate was, what we're doing here, the reps, the sets, the program, the facility, that's not going to make the massive difference on these individuals because their physical assets are already so high. Right? However, if I can get them to understand how to move better and understand how to move better in a manner that doesn't require them to overanalyze their body, they might be able to go to the NFL Combine when they only have 2 repetitions on live television, knowing where people psychologically would probably revert to type and move how they normally move. But if I can help actually upgrade them and help them to have learned better, then could they not go there and run a significantly faster time than they otherwise would if I just used conventional methods? And inevitably, the way that materialized is I interrogated how I used instruction, how I used feedback, just generally how I used language to guide and change the narrative in my athlete's head so that they could learn better and have learning be an easy experience for them, something that they didn't have to overthink about. I'll leave you with this one quote that one of the athletes said when being interviewed about his experience before going to the NFL Combine. And he was saying this, he was in my group. He said, listen, what I love about Exos was they make you faster, they make you a better athlete, but I don't feel like I've had to overthink about how to do it. And it was interesting that is what he had reflected on, because that's exactly was the intention, to get them better, but not make that burden be a mental one on them. Because if that's the case, they're going to overthink, they're going to revert to type, and all that hard work would have been for naught when they got to the NFL Combine.
Fantastic. There's 3 things I've picked out there, Nick, and I'm going to take you That was a really rich description of what you do, and I'm going to take you back to the beginning of what you said there and into the gym because, and perhaps this is my slight bias here, when I've watched soccer players or rugby players or performers in any sport in the gym, I always find that that's quite a rich landscape to develop mental skills. And I think that, as you've alluded to, that communication piece, the in-between the personal trainer and the performer is vital. You talked about communication, you talked about language, and you said you observed a bodybuilder, and he used language to cue their attention, possibly onto a specific muscle, and that mediated performance in the gym. I apologies if I'm kind of putting you on the spot here, but when you reflect back, and maybe you use this in your own work now, I like that language cueing attention to mediate performance or mediate learning. So is it possible to give us an example of what that can look like?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's funny that the earliest experience where I really noticed language influencing performance, as you rightly said, was with a bodybuilder coach, because almost now my perception of how we should use language to teach movement has evolved. So let's use a very simple activity, since you're prompting the weight room, one that everybody likes to do on Monday morning, and that is the bench press. Okay, so we'll talk about the bench press because I think everyone can relate to it in some form or fashion. Push up if you'd prefer. So when we look at language, I think of it like the zoom lens on a camera. Okay, where rightly so, what we're asking them to do is either zoom their attention into something very micro, like the movement or the activation of a muscle, or zooming way out into the environment where it's more the macro, let's say the outcome of a given task. So let's go through that zoom lens. So if we zoom all the way in, we have what we refer to as a narrow internal focus. By internal, meaning internal to the body. So if I'm doing the bench press, an example of a narrow internal focus, and you hear this cue all the time, is squeeze your pecs. Right? So you squeeze your pecs, squeeze your chest, and the person's going for the quote, air quotes here, strong air quotes, of the pump. Okay? So for that example, they would be using that narrow internal cue to try to target the chest muscle. But if you were to target that, what you'd find is, performance-wise, if we were actually be able to measure what you did on that barbell, you wouldn't be able to lift as much weight, you wouldn't be able to move that bar as fast, and you wouldn't be able to move that bar for as many repetitions, right? Because you get fatigued really, really quickly by emphasizing that pec muscle. Okay, so that's your narrow internal. If I wanted to get a little bit more performance, and I wanted to suggest to my attention and suggest to my brain that I want more than just my pec involved, I might tell them to drive their arms, or push your arms away, or even push your fists towards the ceiling. But I reference something more generally to the arm. So now imagine we're zoomed out from the pec, and now we can see the whole arm in place for this specific task.
Yeah.
And we call that a broad internal cue, because now I've broadened my focus from one muscle to a limb. If I then zoom out again, we leave the perimeter of the body, so to speak. Now we're into the environment. Now I have what's called a close external cue. Okay, by external it means environment. Yeah. So now I might start telling them to drive the barbell away from the bench.
Okay.
So notice I have removed all discussion of the human body. I've now started to give them actually a task. What are we trying to do? Get the bar off of you or push it away from the bench. Now let's say I want some performance. I want to see that bar really start to move because I'm working on power production. I might tell them to drive that bench to the ceiling. So now not only am I telling them to drive the barbell to the ceiling, I'm now giving them something so far away that they're trying to do that faster. So it's added a performance element. Now let's say I wanted to make that even more visual. So I've gone from narrow internal, broad internal, close external, far external, that's the ceiling.
Yep.
But that's uninteresting for some people. Let's say I want to make it interesting. Now I tell them, I want you to drive that bar off of you like you're pushing somebody off your body rapidly that you don't want there. So now we can see I've added a visual to the mind. And these micro simulations, we call these analogies, where it's move as if. you are pushing somebody off of you, right? Which would send a pretty strong emotional tone into the nervous system of what I'm trying to get done here. So if we think of that as this continuum, this gradation of these internal cues to the external cues, finishing kind of with an analogy, a visual, so to speak, what we know is the second your attentional focus, the zoom lens of your mind, the second that leaves the perimeter of the body and goes to something external or more analogy-based, at least in that example of the bench press, and we could cite many others, we know that your force production will be improved. We know that your speed on the bar will be improved. And we know the amount of repetitions you can perform will be improved. So those are three pretty important things, not to mention that kinematically, your body's efficiency, just the quality of your movement will improve as well. And that entire area, when I talk about language, in my mind, is what I'm referring to. How can I use language to guide people towards goals or outcomes where my language biases this external focus or even an analogy to bring that rich visual? And that's kind of the zoom lens of attention, so to speak, when teaching movement. And it would be a pretty important takeaway for any coaches or parents or athletes on the call to reflect on is how can I get my language outside of the perimeter of the body?
I really love that, Nick, and I especially, I suppose, as a sports psychologist, I really love that analogy. I mean, a lot of my work is based on metaphor. Metaphor analogy, I think, can really colour performance or colour experience that drives performance. You know, when you utilise emotive language that can really set that nervous system on fire, and that's a very basic way of looking at it, but it can really drive performance, can't it? Here's a question I do have for you in that scenario, is how does that interact with technique? If one feels that technique, there is a specific biomechanical technique for, say, the bench press, and obviously we're talking about and you might correct me here, a reasonably simplistic movement with not too many moving body parts and no decisions as such to be made. But we're going out on that zoom lens, so we go into that external, and I completely agree with you. I can picture myself doing that, and I can picture myself, bar to the ceiling, and then having, bouncing somebody off that bar. I think my performance would improve. Can that be to the detriment of, say, what could be construed as a correct biomechanical technique? Could I get technically sloppy and injure myself?
No, it's a really good question, and we obviously don't have time to go through all the nuance of this area. Yeah. But let me say a couple things. Yeah. Is this, and I'm going to start with a broad answer and then a narrow answer. Okay. So the broad answer is this: when we look at the studies that have compared the gradation of internal cueing to external cueing, which we could come up with many different varieties of both, but again, outside or inside the perimeter of the body, and you look at a number of things that would be suggestive of movement efficiency, and thus something that would be more akin to less risk of injury versus more, okay? We know that kinematically, and from a muscle activation perspective, that even when that cue is generally related to the goal, to the outcome, that there seems to be a nod to kinematics improving, as well as the muscles that support the kinematics or quality of movement. For someone that's not familiar with the kinematic word, quality of movement improves with the support of increased coordination of the way the muscles interact. So here's one way to think about why that happens. If I tell the brain, focus on squeezing the pecs, my assumption is that it is going to be able to hold two different thoughts simultaneously, which if we know anything about attention is very difficult to do. And those two thoughts are as follows. I have to focus on squeezing my pec as hard as I can, but I also still have to focus on doing the bench press. Now, which sounds more distracting? Telling someone to focus on squeezing their pec and trying to complete the full bench press, which hopefully everyone agrees involves more than just the pec, okay? Or asking them to focus on targeting the ceiling and driving that barbell to that target on the ceiling. For me, I would say if the goal of the outcome is to move that bar effectively off my body and safely, then allowing that goal to fill the mind's eye would be a much better starting point than to give a subtask, squeeze the pec, in addition to the outcome task, move the barbell away. Because in the latter case, we're asking that attention to do a lot more work. The fundamental switch between muscle and movement, versus the former is just the movement itself. allowing the body to organize itself in a manner optimal for moving the barbell. Now, we picked a bad example here because the barbell bench press is not that complex. I could actually think of many other movements, sprinting, change of direction, where I agree. Sometimes just saying sprint fast, right, or jump high is not enough if the knees cave in every single time they land or try to take off. So what do? There's a number of ways to attack this, Dan, but one of them that I have seen most successful in my own experience, they've shown it in high jumpers as well as in retraining gait or walking in individuals with Parkinson's disease. And I've since also found it very effective for people when they're learning complex tasks like swinging a baseball bat. And that is the use of tape or stickers. Okay, so let me give an example here. If I'm having somebody jump and I don't want their knees to cave in, I could actually put a piece of tape on the top part of either knee or their shorts, or even tell them to imagine that they have pieces of tape on either side. And let's say right now when we watch them jump, their knees, they're getting all knock-kneed, caved in. We don't like that at all. So what I can now tell them is, I want you to focus, as you're jumping high, just keep the tape apart. Keep the tape apart. And what we find is that, or even an analogy, I want you to jump as if you have a beach ball or a medicine ball between your knees. Those ideas basically color the outcome rather than interfere or constrain it. So I use tape, I use analogy, and what I find is, and the evidence is there to support that, that is less detrimental to the movement process. Whereas if I was to tell them to keep the knees apart or keep a given muscle tight, that actually requires the brain to invest energy in those local areas at the possible expense of allowing the whole movement to be coordinated together. So hopefully I've colored the answer a little bit with a couple different examples here, but the reality is I use physical tape or I use analogy to embed the outcome in a very simple cue.
It absolutely does, and I just think it's such a fascinating area, and I think that whether you're an athletics trainer or a coach of, a traditional coach of motor skills, a coach of technique, you do have a rich landscape of solutions, potential solutions, and it's I think what you're providing there is some compelling evidence that external cues combined with linguistic analogy or metaphor actually produce quite a powerful cocktail towards behavior change. And I like what you said about this notion of the body organizing itself. And I know that you share some mutual friends of mine who are into, say, ecological dynamics. And I know that they will counter what people in our industry will say about information processing. And ecological dynamics is very much, look, there are multiple ways you can approach a task. Here's a task, here's a motor skill task in front of you. There are multiple ways you can approach this because the body organizes itself, or the person organizes him or herself. And I suppose a sport I feel most comfortable speaking about is golf, because that's my background as a coach in sport. And for me, there's a really strong explanation as why you can look at the world's top 20 golfers, the world's top 50 golfers, the world's top 100 golfers, and they all swing differently. The task is to swing a golf club to propel a ball from point A to point B, and they all approach it in a different way. And for me, that's because they've looked at tasks. Yes, they will have had technical lessons, but they still all look differently. And biomechanically, for me, there's not necessarily an optimal model. There may be, but there's not necessarily an optimal model for an individual. And they have to experiment through guided discovery, through driving attention, as you're describing there, through rich forms of language, metaphor, analogy, to enable them to find their way of propelling the ball with that club.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that the reality is what we're talking about here is this whole idea, whether you call it, ecological dynamics, which I get a little bit itchy saying that word. It's very long.
I apologize to everybody for that.
People look at you like your head's on backwards. So we'll use a term that is similar. Some might argue it's slightly different, but it's in the ballpark, and that's this whole idea of constraints, or rather asking what shapes movement. That's a cool way to think about it. So we ask what shapes movement, and I think it's a great example of your top 100 golfers, and that is this idea that they're all probably slightly different heights. They all probably have slightly different mobility and stability in their various joints, strength and power, limb length, so on and so forth. So just rocking up to the actual tee, so to speak, they're all coming with different physical constraints or different physical assets, however you want to turn that coin over. And then the reality is from there, where they place their attention in the environment very much so will meld together with those physical assets, giving birth to what we call their swing. And if we look over time, the reality is how they change their body adaptively with the strength training they do, the exercise they do, just the physical activities in general, even golf itself, and how they change their focus over time will create their progress, so to speak. So I think at the end of the day, what we focus on in the environment and the physical assets that we have and the physical environment itself and its restrictions it creates, those things meld together to give us any given moment of movement that we observe. And I think there's something really interesting here because, and this is where I'll put my strength conditioning hat on. When we look at this, we have to ask ourselves, are we dealing with, let's say we're talking about an error here. It doesn't matter what the movement is, but an error that is causing a performance decrement. And thus we say, okay, this error is loud enough that ourselves and the player or the athlete wants to do something about it. Okay, we have to then start to understand what the nature of the error is. Is the error being caused by one of those physical restrictions? Mobility, stability, strength, and power. Sorry, we can't change limb length and height, but the controllable factors of the body. Or is it a function of how this person is paying attention and what the narrative of their head, how that is melding with their current physical assets?
Yeah.
For me, if it's a mechanical issue, if it's a car issue, if it's a hardware issue, whatever metaphor you want to chuck at the body, then obviously we can address that directly with your physiotherapist, with your strength conditioning coach, with just good practice. However, I think a lot of the cases what we're dealing with is they are not gaining the right information from either their body or the environment. So either they're not listening to their body correctly or they're not gaining the information from the physical environment. So in this case, that's where for me, whether you use a physical constraint such as limiting the amount of space around them, or in soccer, let's say, changing the rules whereby you can only have 2 touches or you have to pass it to everybody, whatever it might be, by constraining something in the environment, for me, all you are doing is forcing their attention to focus on something new in the environment with the hope that that is going to give them new information that would act in a similar way of giving them a cue in the first place. So the question is, do you just want to give them a cue which kind of directs the spotlight, or do you want that spotlight of the mind to be compelled to focus on something by changing the environment itself? Either way, we're trying to shift their focus to get the right information to help that movement progress.
In simple terms, coaching is driving people's attention.
I really do believe it is. The chief responsibility of a coach is to capture, keep, and direct attention.
And a part of that could be driving self-awareness, helping players become more self-aware of what they're doing now. So when you're driving that self-awareness, you are driving attention. You're driving it towards whether it's players becoming more aware of their thought processes, their feelings, their affect, their emotion, or their movement. You're driving somebody's attention, and when you help them become more self-aware, there's a greater chance of changing behaviour, would you say?
100%. And I think, when you see someone that is adopting a behavior or a movement pattern, which movement we could argue is a form of behavior, if we see them adopting a movement pattern and it's not changing, it's stable, it's stuck the way it is, and you as a coach are like, ooh, I'm not quite happy with that. The reality is, what we have to know is that is not their body or their brain's current interpretation.
Yep.
Their current interpretation is it is good enough. And the reality is that we have to use your term, drive self-awareness of that error at some level, either implicitly, so they just kind of feel it, they notice it. They can't quite put it into words, but they now notice something is wrong, or in certain cases, explicitly. We draw their attention directly to the issue at hand. But in all those cases, what are we trying to do? We're trying to refine that feedback loop. And I typically, when I teach this stuff, talk about these negotiating tools, right? As a coach, you have negotiating tools, and what you're trying to negotiate with is the body of the athlete or the player in front of you. And you can either negotiate directly by using your language and telling them exactly, again, what to focus on, or you can negotiate by using the environment so that they can either experience something. So you either use do-based language, so do this, focus on this, or notice-based experiences. You change something in the environment that forces them to adopt a different movement pattern. And again, oftentimes it's as simple as shifting the amount of space they have to perform the movement, right? Shifting the amount of time, adding some equipment, changing some rules. But either way, we're dealing with the currency of attention. And if we can refine the information that feedback loop gives them, so now they're like, yeah, that does feel odd. I got to do something about that. Now they have the opportunity to self-correct, which is really what we're chasing here, for them to own the change.
Interesting, and that's a kind of neat segue onto my second point with what you said, which was some time ago now, but you said the big part of your role over the last decade has been to optimize the assets of a player. They might come out and have lightning speed, but they do so in quite a chaotic fashion, and you feel that you can help them optimize that speed or get even quicker or get more efficient with that speed by helping them move better. I help people to move better. And to be able to do that, you mentioned that you have to help them learn better, and I think you've kind of alluded to that in the last couple of minutes with your negotiating tools. I negotiate directly. I negotiate the environment. I know that you have a sort of a triangular module of optimizing the environment, and you're going to have to help me out here. So it's optimizing the environment, optimizing the
task or the skill.
Right, okay, and then there's a top one as well.
The body, right, or the player or the athlete.
Yeah, okay. So when you've got a player in front of you, and we're obviously going to have to speak generically here because every case study is going to be different, but where do you usually start? You talk about negotiating directly or negotiating the environment. Would you start with the environment first? Would you start with a conversation with the player and have direct instruction first? What mediates where you start with a player?
It's a really good question. And again, for me, it goes back to trying to understand where the nature of the opportunity for improvement lives. And typically it's going to live in a couple of different locations. So let's use the triangle as an outline to answer the question. So if everyone can imagine a very simple triangle, and at the top of the triangle, we can kind of imagine that's your athlete. Yep. Or that's your player's body. Yep. And think of that as quite literally everything inside the perimeter of the body, to use that term again. This is their physical assets, okay? So some of those assets we can change. Some of those assets we cannot, okay? So we can't change how old they are. We can't change their injury history, how tall they are, their limb length, their bone density, so to speak, at any given moment. Long term, though, what can we shift? We can probably shift strength, power, mobility, stability, and other physical factors, okay? But on any given day, they're walking up with physical faculties or a physical literacy, so to speak, and that is kind of the resources that they have. So if we imagine we're in that scenario, we're on the pitch, we can't change any of those physical factors right now. Wouldn't you want to know as a coach if what is limiting them is one of those physical factors? I would. Because the reality is, if you continue to negotiate with your cues, right, or you continue to negotiate by changing something in the environment, you are not going to see them be able to magically adopt an improved hip position, whether it be in golf or scrummaging in rugby, if they have an issue with that left hip, let's say. So to answer your first question is, I have some kind of screening that the athlete needs to go through so that I can understand their physical faculties. I can understand what assets we have and what limitations we have. And thus we know we can take then a parallel approach of working on those physical limitations as well as maximizing those physical assets. And I believe, to take a term we've used so far, that allows us to bring in the psychology of the learning. And that is this. If I'm an athlete who is constantly being cued, and I'm hearing the same cue or the same instruction over and over again, and I feel like I am doing everything the coach is saying, yet I continue to hear that same reminder every single day. And no one has ever told me that one of the reasons it's going to take me a little bit longer than the other players next to me to sort this thing out is because of all the work I'm doing with the physio to get my hip right. You know what I mean? So I think from a psychological perspective, it's very important to know which are hardware issues and which are software issues. Because the individuals that have hardware issues, right, the top part of that triangle, it's going to take them longer to learn because they don't have all of the physical assets yet to climb the mountain, so to speak. Okay? So that's the first thing, is we screen them and we explain to the player how that is going to possibly interact long term. Okay? Mm-hmm. From there, then, I'm a big believer is I need to watch you move before I coach you to move. And I'm just going to say that one more time because it's a mistake I've made many times, is I need to watch you move before I coach you how to move. Okay? So from that perspective, part of the screening process is just that. It's to watch the pattern. It's to watch how their body interprets the movement or the task that I'm asking of them. Okay? And once I feel I've watched them move enough, I know what sits behind the curtain as best I can on the physical assets. I have a pretty good idea of where to target my coaching. Okay? So now that I know where to target my coaching, and let's say it has something to do with the way they're rotating, whatever it might be. Think of your sport and think of a common error. Okay, insert there. Now I have two different assets I believe I can use. We've been talking about them the entire time. I can use a direct or an indirect approach to making that change. The direct is the cueing. It's a top-down. Think about this. And my hope is that by them thinking about that while they move, it'll make the movement better right now and in the future. The alternative is the indirect or the guided approach, where now I say, okay, I'm not going to give you a lot of instruction here. I'm going to change something in the environment. So it might be, for example, I don't know, in golf, you can tell me if this is wrong, but if the swing path isn't what you want, I don't know, possibly do you put a line on the ground and say, hey, just try to stay inside this line. Yeah. And what you are trying to encourage is a straighter path, I would imagine, to the contact with the ball. Yep. So now you're using visual information, but you're limiting space. You're basically saying, hey, there's the proverbial wall here. I'm not going to tell you how to do it. Just don't freaking hit the wall. Swing straight. And now they have to extract their information, their cueing, so to speak, from the physical, visible environment itself. It's still information. It's still guiding their attention, but it's allowing them to problem solve a little bit more. So when we talk about should we use a direct or an indirect approach, I think it makes complete sense that the more natural form of learning, by natural I mean guided by an external entity, being another human, is going to be the indirect approach. It's shifting something physically in the environment first. And if we've targeted the right error, Dan, and we know that we have chosen the right constraint, and we saw that that constraint has gotten them, a few degrees closer to where we want, but inevitably they're still not quite getting it, at that point, why not come in with a little bit of advice? Hey, why don't you focus on this on your next repetition? Or have you ever thought about this? Or, hey, imagine you were here. Try to do this as if that was your reality right now. And in that case, I think of cues like simulated constraints. If I can't bring it literally into the environment, can I allow you to simulate something in your head and move as if, right? So in summary, know what physically limits the person, because you're not going to be able to change that with your cues and constraints, and you need that to guide their learning journey so they don't lose faith in you or themselves. And then from there, you can go top-down cues, or you can go bottom-up constraints, direct and indirect. Start with the constraints. Give them a problem to solve. People like solving problems, so it's more motivationally interesting anyhow. And once you've seen that they've exhausted their ability to get information from that environment, come with a little nudge, not a knock, a nudge, with a little cue, the more visual the better, to give them a new perspective on how to attack that problem that we're calling the movement. And for me, that's how we put this whole thing together.
Based on the notion of individual differences, again, slightly putting you on the spot, and the answer just might be no, I'd always do it the way that you've just told me. Have you ever experienced a scenario when you've worked with an athlete where you've just gone straight to direct because of his or her personality, because of what you know about them as a person? I don't know what particular personality traits that might interact with, but have you ever gone straight to direct rather than exploring indirect first?
It probably, to be honest with you, it might have more to do with the task than it does with the individual at first. So if this was something really complex and dangerous, like Olympic lifting, let's say, then I probably would, by pure sense of ethical responsibility to them, give them the mental tools, right, that I know will allow them to be safe in the lift, right? Whereas something like change of direction, where we're just moving in space and it's just body weight based, I might allow that to be a little bit more exploratory. I think the key thing that I might not be unveiling is this. Before we would attack the Olympic lifting, or before we would attack the agility session, let's say, I would always begin those sessions with a little bit of a what, why, how narrative. Okay, what are we doing? Why are we doing it? And how we're going to do it. Okay, so the what and the why starts to settle their mind of why are we even doing this Olympic lifting? How does it relate to my ultimate goal of being a better rugby player, let's say? Or why are we doing this agility work? How is it going to relate to my ultimate goal of being a better soccer player or footballer? So we've done that. We've hopefully tapped the motivational side to draw the mental connection. Gotcha. And then it's the how. Okay, so from a how perspective, I say today we're going to go ahead and we're going to try some things out. You're not going to hear me give you a lot of instruction. I want to see how you solve the problem. And for me, for the person that normally, let's say personality-wise, Dan, likes a lot of instruction, likes a lot of detail, possibly likes someone to explain everything before they even perform it, I think I'm still going to be able to appeal to them by doing it that way, because I've explained the reasoning and the approach. And I've let them know, hey, this is not going to be void of feedback. This is not going to be void of my coaching expertise. Just where I'm putting that coaching expertise might be in a little bit of a different order than what you're used to.
Somebody says to you, just tell me what to do. Nick, just tell me what to do. You can give me the whys, the whats, the wherefores. Just tell me what to do. How do you act on that information as a coach?
So I think it's a great question. It's one that I've gotten many times. Yes. When I was initially playing around with these approaches of more coaching, less coaching, internal versus external, I absolutely had people just say, when I was still sorting this out for myself, you give this explanation. Okay, so what do you want me to do? Right? So I've heard that. I know exactly what you're saying. And in that case, for me, in that moment, in that instinctual moment, I come back with a simple cue of the outcome. I realize that I have not told them the punchline. I have not told them ultimately the purpose of what I want. And in that case, I give them that purpose. And then I'll ask them a question. Does that explain to you clearly what I'm after, or do you need additional clarification? And for me, it's a matter of a conversation. The reality is we're not building these relationships in any one instant, right? It's a series of moments. It's a series of instances over time. And the reality is with what you're describing to me there is I want to talk to them. I want to ask them a few questions to understand what's going on in their headspace, because obviously I haven't done a good enough job explaining the outcome. And if that's the case, it's starting by explaining the outcome very, very clearly, giving them an opportunity to feedback. Okay, does that now clarify what you're looking for? And if they're looking for, no, I want to know exactly the technique that you're looking for, then that probably would prompt me to have a bit more of a discussion with them, because I've had the athletes that want that. They want me to break down biomechanically exactly what's supposed to happen in the given skill. And I find that was not by chance. If you look back at how that person was coached, if I'm coming in later on in their career, they are someone that has been drowned in technical information their entire life, and thus they believe that is the right way to think while they move, which is to think in a step-by-step fashion of how all the joints, how all the muscles, how everything needs to come together. And that takes a little bit of unlearning, so to speak, that, hey, that isn't the best way for you to perform. That isn't the best way for you to succeed. But you can't just pull the rug from them. You can't just take away all that information. So thus it has to be a discussion. And without us having a very, very detailed example or a case study, that would be my way of approaching it. Give them a clear outcome if I haven't already, and then give them an opportunity, probably after the session, to unpack their desired ways or the way they believe they learn best.
What I hear you saying then, Nick, is I have an internal locus of control when I coach. Internal locus of control being psychological jargon for I attribute myself, I'm responsible here, I'm in charge. This person brings different needs, wants, hopes, doubts, beliefs, expectations, cultures, different personality to the table. It's my responsibility to help this player have as rich a learning experience as possible, a potential combination of indirect and direct coaching, and I'm responsible as the coach. I can get this right. Would that be fair to say? Because I just think this is such an interesting landscape, because I think that coaches allow themselves the liberty to say, oh, well, it's the player's responsibility, and I attribute the player. And in many respects, in an elite environment, and I'm sure you'll appreciate this, is we want the players to be responsible for themselves.
Of course.
We want them to be intelligent decision makers. But there's that, I think, I almost think sometimes, Nick, when I step into elite environments that are working really well, where the relationships between players and coaches are strong, is actually, it's a combined internal locus of control. It's like the coaches feel responsible for improvement, and the players feel responsible for improvement. Both sides have that internalized attribution of it's about me, it's about us.
Yeah, I no, 100%. And I think the way from your own perspective, the way you've described how you're hearing me suggest my approach is very much so. You nailed it. And if I can use my term, I want to be an adaptable coach.
Yep.
That's really what it comes down to. The same way that we want an adaptable player, I want to be an adaptable coach. And the opposite of an adaptable coach is a rigid coach. And what's a rigid coach? A rigid coach has a fixed set of activities, fixed set of ideas, a fixed set of language, for which when an athlete doesn't seem to be responding, they say it more often and they say it louder. Right? I think we've all met that individual. And if a player has success with them, it's more by chance, not choice, that they happen to align with this coach's behavior. But you're right, for every player that doesn't align with their behavior, the coach's default is to do more of the same, and the only way they go to bed at night is offloading the responsibility completely back onto the player, not recognizing their requirement to adapt, and the fact that player just doesn't understand. And thus communication isn't what is said, it's what is understood. Thus that coach can improve their communication with that specific player. The flip side of that, on the other side of the continuum, is the adaptable coach. And in my opinion, what's an adaptable coach? They abide by principles, not fixed methods. And those principles allow them to adapt to the context and the player in front of them. And you're right, it's an interdependent relationship. Both people have to play a role. I believe coaches, in most cases, need to move from boss to business partner. And where they need to know how to coach is how to involve the player at the right time, at the right place, and the right amount. And that has a lot of different factors that feed into it. But the metaphor I would use is this. Anyone that goes to climb a mountain, let's think of a notable mountain like Everest, is going to hire out some kind of a guide. Okay? What's that guide going to do? That guide is going to provide pertinent information for success. They are going to provide pertinent equipment for success. They're going to ensure that the things that the person does not know, they do not know, are brought to bear front of mind, especially if it relates to safety. But at the end of the day, who has to climb the mountain, right? The person still has to climb the mountain. Independent of all that support that guide has brought, the person still has to put one foot in front of the other. Now, when it just so happens that foot is about to lead them off a cliff, a coach has a responsibility to nudge them back on track. But once they've nudged them back on track, who has to keep on walking? Right, that person. I very much so believe that is a accurate and hopefully simple metaphor for coaching, in that you cannot devoid either party of their responsibility. Great coaches just know who needs to be responsible for what at what moment.
And I think the toughest thing about being that guide on Everest is it's so compelling to take the same track or guide a person up the same track, up the same path, day after day, week after week, month after month, year after year, rather than keeping an open mind that there might be other tracks that might be safer or might be quicker, might be more optimal. And the reason why I'm saying that, Nick, and using your metaphor, because I come back to what you're saying about adaptability versus rigidity. It's so important for coaches to be mentally nimble. And the reason why I say that is because I'm coming to, I know, something that's a real passion for you, is this topic of heuristics, which sounds a horrible name, and you're going to enlighten us in a second, but to be adaptable, to take, you want to search for different tracks, optimal tracks. You've got to be adaptable. You've got to be mentally nimble. You cannot be mentally nimble if you have that confirmation bias, if you like, that bias every day of what I'm doing is right, what I'm doing is right, this is the way, this is the way, this is the only way. And I think the toughest thing for a coach is to be able to hoist themselves above what they're doing and above what everybody does and says, hang on, is this the most optimal way for this situation, for this team, for this club?
Yes.
What is somebody else doing? How else can I look at this? I think that as human beings, we are almost embedded within us is this notion. It's almost a survival thing, isn't it, Nick, of keeping the same things day in, day out. It's almost like a homeostatic impulse that we have. We've got to stay the same. We've got to do the same thing. It feels comfortable, but nimbleness, adaptability is so important. So tell us a bit about what your thoughts are there on heuristics and that kind of stuff.
So you just said something there that struck me and got me to think about this a little bit different. And let me just start with a little bit of a short kind of maybe mental experiment here, or at least thought experiment. And that is, if we imagine, thousands of years ago when we were more in a hunter-gatherer type community, and obviously we can still find these various communities in remote parts of the world. The reality is you lived with a fixed number of individuals. Each group played a role. Information that was relevant to the survival of the tribe or the community was passed down from one generation to the next, or even would have been someone who had probably that responsibility to record that in some form or fashion to ensure that best practices were handed down, and more than likely those best practices related to the survival of the tribe. And you had a fixed amount of ground that you had to cover. And inevitably, through the death of some and survival of others, you learned how to eat the right plant versus the wrong plant. How to take down animal A versus animal B. And again, all of that inevitably was information brought on board, which improved the overall the survival intellect of the entire group. But imagine then how much you actually needed to know. It was fairly fixed, wasn't it? Right? You had your role within the community. You had a lot of interdependency on others.
Yep. And
the whole goal was predictability, that you knew if you did A, you would get B, so on and so forth. But now look at the world we live in, right? That was the world that absolutely galvanized the anatomy of our brain, I believe.
Yes.
And now we're in a world where we have to adapt to so many different tribes, so many different cultures. And while maybe we are not going to be eating the poisonous berry or getting bit by the poisonous snake, we have other ones that are intellectual equivalents that bring about, mental struggle that so many people have, whether it's things that are less threatening, like paralysis by analysis in sport, all the way to the severe cases of depression and otherwise. But either way, we have our equivalents in this day and age. So why? Well, here's what I believe. I believe our brains are adapted to be very fixed in what they can process and the amount of information they can handle at any one time. I've given you an example of why I think that is, biologically and evolutionarily speaking. Yep. So fast forward now to today. We still are dealing with we can only deal with the experiences we've had, okay? So if I'm a head coach of a sports team, I have only seen so many athletes of a given variety. I've seen the strong athlete. I've seen the fast athlete. I've seen the workhorse athlete who needs to work a lot to be healthy. I've seen the athlete, if they work too much, they break down immediately. So you have to wrap them in a bit more of cotton wool. So I have this world, these experiences that create my world. I have these experiences that create my average understanding of that world. And within those experiences, I have the outliers that sit on either side of that. But nonetheless, that world is defined by my experiences, which means that world is not the world. Okay, it is not the world, the truthful world that represents all possible people and all possible experiences. It just resembles the ones by chance and a part choice that I have come into contact with. Okay, so here's where then the story of biases begin. So instead of thinking of the word heuristic, which is basically a mental shortcut, for our conversation, we can think of it as bias, which is mental defaults, things that you default to in given circumstances. And one of these biases is called, and probably the one that we need to be most aware of, is called the availability bias.
Yep.
Okay, the availability bias. And what is the availability bias? The availability bias is this. It's things that are easier to remember, you rate as higher in truth. Okay, I'll say it one more time. Things that are easier to remember, you rate higher in their factual truth. You think simply because it is easier to recall, somehow it makes the truthfulness of it higher. But if we go back to my original example, if your world is only defined by your limited number of experiences, not the ultimate representation of all possible experiences, you have to then understand that the availability bias will get you to look at the world through that limited lens. And if you don't know that, you might map a decision onto a player, onto an interaction, onto an experience that actually might not be best for what that player needs, for what that interaction requires, or what that experience judgmentally requires to be called upon. So if people understand then that they have a lens that has been galvanized and shaped purely by their own experiences, when they then come into contact with any important interaction whereby a decision, do I play the player, do I not? Should I do more speed work with my team this offseason? Should I not? Should I do more maximal strength training with this specific player to help their speed, or should I not? When we go through all of those decisions, if you understand that your world is limited and that you are going to be biased towards what your experiences have taught you, then you might just pause for a moment to ask one more question, to do one more assessment, to consult with one other person, interdisciplinary team primarily, to ensure that your judgment is not one that is simply confirming your own biases, which is said to say confirming what your own experiences have told you. And thus breaking beyond that, outside of what is available to your own headspace, consulting with data, consulting with people, consulting with individuals whose experiences are different than yours, who outline a part of the world for which you have not had direct contact. I believe that is the way we overcome this availability bias and put ourselves in the best position to help others in sport, which is why the interdisciplinary team is so frickin' important, because you have people with vastly different experiences that can be the checks and balances.
I'm a grassroots coach. I'm not, but I'm just saying I am. Okay. I'm a grassroots coach. You've just mentioned that it's important to have an interdisciplinary team, and
yes.
that's available at the elite level.
It is.
How does a grassroots coach take what you've just said? Because I've still got to go and deliver my hour and a half this evening or tomorrow night. How does a grassroots coach take that notion and become adaptable, become less entrenched in their beliefs and deal with this similarity bias? Is there anything that they can practically do to help them become more adaptable, become
100%.
more nimble?
Okay, 100%. So we have to ensure that our feedback loop we use as coaches, I don't care if you're the grassroots coach, your mom and dad working with a team on the weekend, or you're at the elite level. Okay, we have to ensure that we have a strong feedback loop. We have to have a reference point to know how we are going as a coach. And if that feedback loop stops at what you say and what you do, in my opinion, you are losing out on an immense opportunity. What do I mean by that? If your feedback loop is, oh, I'm happy with what I said today. Okay? If your feedback loop is, oh, I'm happy with what I did today, then for me, you have not actually given yourself time to look at the echo of your effectiveness. Because if John Wooden said, which he did, you haven't taught until they've learned, then your feedback loop can't stop on your perception of teaching, which is what you've said and what you've done. No, your perception of whether or not you're teaching effectively needs to stop at, okay, are they improving? And not just are they improving, is everybody improving to some degree? To some degree. How do you do that? A couple things. One, you need to be present when you coach. The second you speak, you need to watch eyes, body language, and movement, verbal and nonverbal. And when you think that the body is suggesting to you that they're not getting it, your cues aren't hitting, your constraints aren't working, then you need to be able to have a conversation with that individual. Hey, Johnny, how do you think today's session went today? Okay. Hey, what were you focusing on during that drill? Oh, this, that, and the other. Oh, okay, cool. You know when I gave you that cue? Oh, no, coach, I didn't hear it. Okay. The next time we're out doing that drill, this is what I'd like you to focus on. What does that mean to you, right? They give you their feedback back. Okay, fantastic. Let's bring that in to the focus for the next time we do that drill, and I'll remind you. So now what we're doing is we are seeing verbally and non-verbally what is going on with our players. If we are aware of verbally and non-verbally what is going on with our players, we are getting rich information to look at what cues are hitting, what cues are failing, what constraints are hitting, what constraints are failing. If I can then take 5 minutes, 1 minute, pen to paper or in my own head, and jot down those mental notes of what went well and who did it go well with, if that matters, let's exploit that moving forward. And what didn't go well? What was not hitting? And especially the things that are not hitting time and time again. You should become alerted to those because that's, in my opinion, your biggest opportunity for improvement. So once you have that feedback loop refined, you can see the echo of your teaching and whether or not they are learning. That then should outline to you your strengths and your opportunities for improvements. Once you have those opportunities for improvements, I believe, Dan, that is starting to represent your blind spots. That is starting to represent where innately you are losing the plot when you are coaching. You are not naturally adopting the right language, the right constraints to make a difference in that category, whatever it might be. And thus those opportunities need to become your roadmap to make those blind spots disappear and turn into vision. How do you do that? Well, that's where we get into professional development. It's you picking up the phone and having a network of people that you can call, right? Even if it's someone just with a slightly different perspective than you, whose lived experience is different. Alternatively, it's how you're driving your own professional development. Rather than going to the same strength and conditioning conference every year that you go to, maybe you've identified that your ability to communicate is not as effective as it should. So you take a presentation or a communication course, or you invest your money to go into a sports psychology workshop, let's say, or sports psychology conference. And possibly instead of buying your 100th, right, sports psychology book, you buy a book on movement and how to coach movement. Right? Whatever your blind spot is, it doesn't matter. But you will never sort out your blind spot, no matter what level you're at, if you don't give yourself some kind of feedback loop, which means the information that is the echo of your effectiveness doesn't stop with what you say, doesn't stop with what you do. It's what you see. It's what you experience. And if the echo of your effectiveness is making its way into your players, then you're doing a good job. And where it's not making its way into your players, use that as information, have better discussions, and drive your own professional development. And all we are trying to do is widen our experiential truth of what reality is, not the reality that we perceive.
What you said there reminds me of two things that two people have said to me. And the first one is from Stuart Armstrong, and I'm going to slightly paraphrase him, so hopefully I'm not doing a disservice, which is see every activity you do as a mini experiment.
Yeah, love it. Yeah, love it.
See every activity as a mini experiment. And that kind of alludes to your notion of, this is an experiment. What works? What's good? What can I repeat? What didn't go so well? How does that interact with player feedback, etc.? So seeing every activity as a mini experiment. And then secondly, something the educationalist Doug Lemov said to me actually on this podcast, which is your notion of you need to be present. And he said, coaching, as you're coaching, collect behavioural data. Observation is merely collecting behavioural data. So it's observing and collecting the data in terms of the runs, the movement, the behaviours, what's happening, are they engaging, are they focused, where's their attention. This is just behavioural data you need to receive, process and act upon.
100%. 100%. And it goes back to your first question, Dan. You asked me. It was the moment where I started doing that. It was the moment where I looked up from my training plan and started looking at people, started looking at the player. And the second my vision went to the people and the players that I was working with, all of a sudden I saw a clear path forward.
And again, coming back to what you were saying there for a few minutes, that notion of going away, having CPD, continuing professional development. I also think it's the attitude within your CPD. It's refusing to blindly accept a piece of knowledge within that CPD, asking questions around that piece of knowledge or those pieces of knowledge, asking questions of the people who are educating you. Something from my own playbook that I've tried to do, and coming back to constraints-led, we'll use that term, constraints-led versus an information process, kind of direct instruction. I grew up, Nick, in a golfing world, which was I go to a golf coach, that golf coach tells me what to do around improving my technique, and that ultimately leads to better shots, which leads to better scores and better outcomes. Hypothetically, what I've tried to do in the past year is, I know that you've seen there's lots of debate on Twitter and various social media platforms around this constraints-led versus information, probably direct instruction debate. For me, it's rather than putting both feet in a specific camp, it's trying to take the helicopter viewpoint and look at both. And somewhere along this last hour or so, you've given me a neat, that idea of direct and indirect, top down, bottom up, having both. How can I have both? Maybe purists from constraints-led would say, well, hang on a minute, Nick, that goes against the theory here. That goes against the theory because theoretically, people, players, organise themselves. So why, you can't therefore have direct instruction. But I don't know what you think about that, but I certainly think that I'm a better coach of psychology, or I'm a better guide within skill acquisition, say, which I do a little bit of now, when I have an appreciation of both camps, and when I can dip my toe into one camp and another camp, and not committing too much, and just constantly critiquing these ideas, critiquing myself, and seeing every day as mini experiments.
No, I think I'm really encouraged by that synopsis. I think you've captured definitely what I've gotten out of the conversation. I'm very happy that what you said there is the echo of it, because that's in fact what I intended. At the end of the day, I don't buy into any conversation that tries to put constraints up against cueing or whatever other word you want to throw at language or information processing or direct didactic teaching. I would say this to anyone that does. If you can go home at night when you've had an amazing day or a really bad day, and when your head is on the pillow, if you have enough mental control just to shut down your consciousness, to stop the internal narrative, I would like to know how to do that. because the second you can do that, then maybe I would buy into a completely indirect approach. The reality is this: there is a narrative constantly playing inside of our head. There are always two coaches on the pitch. There's you and the person inside of your player's head. And for me, I believe it's not a matter of whether or not we should cue, whether or not we should coach. That's not the right question. It's what is the best quality of cueing? What is the best quality of coaching that will allow us to guide and direct their attention most appropriately so they can gain the right information from the environment, yes, to own and be empowered to drive their own learning process. But to completely remove our ability to guide that internal narrative, I believe would be a massive lost opportunity and would be ill-advised, because the reality is psychology trumps motor learning. And in my opinion, what do I mean by that? Simple. If your player loses belief in you, if your player does not understand why you are doing what you are doing, if you do not give them enough why and the what, which requires your language, which requires you to discuss and engage them, I believe that you will lose the plot, you will lose their attention, full stop. And if that happens, I don't care if it's cueing or constraints, it won't work. So you need your cues, you need your constraints, you need your top down, you need your bottom up. It is a feedback loop that works as one, not as separate entities.
Well, I think for sure it's a fascinating debate, and I think we're all getting, it can get heated at times, but I think we're all getting richer for the conversation, and I think you neatly and eloquently sum up your position on that one, and we're certainly quite similar and not poles apart. Nick, look, thank you so much for your time. As you said to me before we recorded, you've been on the road somewhat, and I really do appreciate you taking some time out to speak to me and to speak to the Sports Psych Show audience. Yeah. Listen, mate, how can people find your work? Because I know people would have been, their ears would have been glued to this one. So how can people find you and your work?
Probably the best places are on Twitter primarily and Instagram. So it's just my name, at Nick Winkelman, and Winkelman spelled E-L, not L-E. Most people would make that mistake, but it's all one word. Yeah. And so those are the two areas I try to put out information that hopefully is helpful in and around this area. And
mate, you've got a book coming out soon, haven't you? So people have got to keep a lookout for that.
Yeah, it's coming out end of next year, and it'll be on the language of coaching. Yep.
Brilliant, perfect. Nick, thanks so much for your time, mate. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dan. Appreciate it.
Everybody, that was Nick Winkelman. Big thanks to him for taking the time to speak to me. If you enjoyed that, please do leave a rating and a review. And don't forget to subscribe to the Sports Psych Show to be alerted about future episodes. I look forward to next week's episode. Bye for now.